G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza, and in this video we're going to be using Adobe Flash, and I'm using version CS6, and we're going to look at the difference between the three symbol types: graphic, movie clip, and button. I want to take some time to break down the differences between them, the pros and cons to each, in what scenarios you would use them and apply them, and how they come across in the timeline, how they are used and kind of act differently. So to start off with, I have just these three basic shapes. They're nothing yet. We're going to turn them into symbols, so we're really going to cover everything from the start. I really hope that this video explains a lot of things to early users, but I also intend for it to cover some things that hopefully should teach some intermediate or even advanced users a couple of things. So if I select my circle on the right and right click it, you have this option to convert it to a symbol. Now there is a shortcut, and I like to use the shortcut, and that is F8, and you can of course change that shortcut, and you get this little pop-up here that says convert to symbol, and you have a few little options that you can fill in. Now this circle on the right I'm going to use as a button, so I'm going to call this button. That's very creative of me, and I'm going to select the type to be button. You can see there are these three types: movie clip, button, and graphic, like I mentioned before. I'm going to select button. Now you can see there are a few other options around here, and you can even bring up a whole bunch more by clicking advanced. You're really not going to want to mess with those unless you're doing multimedia interactive based content, games, web stuff, all of that. We're not going to worry about that at the moment. We're really going to focus on this tutorial on practical uses for this sort of thing in animations. So we can forget about the advanced thing, and the folder thing we'll just leave in the library root, because that's all that matters to us at the moment. And as for registration, that again is one of those things that I've only ever used in application of creating games and interactive content. So I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to create a default button and hit OK. And there we have a button. I'm going to do the same thing with these other two. So the middle clip, hit F8. I'm going to call this movie clip, change the type to movie clip, and hit OK. So we have a movie clip symbol, and I'm going to hit F8 on the circle on the left. I'm going to call this graphic, and there you go, a graphic. Now, seemingly on the surface level, all of these three circles look the same. They have the same property where, let's say if 100 frames out, I drag them all up and add a tween between them, I can now tween these symbols, so they all have the ability to be tweened like that. And they all now have their own internal timeline. So if I double click the graphic, I have a blank space where I can animate it inside itself. The same thing happens if I double click inside the movie clip. It's got its own timeline, and the graphic has its own timeline, but it's a little bit different, and we're going to touch a bit more on that later. So on the surface, these things seem pretty similar. You can do similar things with them, but when you get into more advanced things, when you're animating scenes and you're using these for various purposes, the differences become pretty apparent. And if you're not actually aware of what it's doing, it can be hugely frustrating and confusing, especially to entry-level creators of content. So to demonstrate the differences between the movie clip and the graphic symbols, which are the two main kinds of symbols that animators tend to use, I'm going to enter the movie clip of each of them and extend to, let's say, 50 frames along. I'm going to hit F6. F6 duplicates the keyframe that you have at the end of that frame, and I'm going to change the color just by dragging the slider into a green. Now if I right click in this middle area here and click create shape tween, this inside color area you can see transitions from the blue to the green. Now I'm going to select this green circle, hit Ctrl-Alt-C to copy that frame exactly, and I'm going to double click outside of it to go back to the main timeline and go inside my movie clip symbol, and I'm going to paste the frame I copied on frame 50 of this timeline by hitting Ctrl-Alt-V, which pastes the exact replica of what I copied, and do the same thing, create a shape tween. So now inside both of these timelines I have the exact same animation. Now, how do they act differently? By all intents and purposes, if I go inside each of them, they play the same thing. One thing that you'll notice though is if I hit Ctrl-Enter to test what I've created, you can see that the only thing playing is the movie clip. So what's happening here is on the actual main timeline, there is only one frame available to play through on the main timeline for each of these symbols, and yet the movie clip symbol is the only one that's playing through. That is the first and most apparent thing that becomes pretty quickly obvious to people who start using these symbols, is that the movie clips always kind of animate regardless of the duration of space they're given on the main timeline. From the first frame that they're visible on a timeline, they start playing their internal animation. The next thing that animators notice is that if I drag this timeline out to frame 50 by hitting F5, the only thing that plays in the actual main timeline is the graphic. So that's the next most apparent thing that's noticeable, is that graphics play in real time in the timeline. You can see the internal animation of the graphic happening in the main timeline, whereas the movie clip is completely stuck on the first frame of the movie clip. So the interesting thing that's happening here is as I play on the main timeline, the graphic animates, but now if I hit Control Enter to render, both of them are playing, and that's because it's actually playing on both the main timeline and the internal timeline of each of the clips. You'll also notice if I edit the duration of the main timeline, let's say bringing everything down to like about 25 frames and hit Control Enter, things start going askew because the movie clip has the full 50 frames that it's going to continuously loop because it's forever present. It doesn't matter to the movie clip that there's only 25 frames, but the graphic only uses the 25 frames of the main timeline that it's present, and then it starts again. Movie clips are most used for games and interactive media because they can have action script or code attached to them to give them actions. So if I'm creating a video game character or making a game with a coder, I will do everything in movie clips for the most part. Another thing that differentiates graphics and movie clips is if I hit V just to have my selection tool and click on them, you can see in the properties panel on the left there are a few different options available. So when I have the graphics selected, the only options available are I can add a tint or brightness or use some advanced stuff or alpha or whatever like we have listed there, or I can act on the loop thing, so I can have things stuck on the first frame so it doesn't play on the main timeline, or I can have it continuously loop. Whereas when I select this movie clip, you'll notice that the loop option that it has here in looping is not on the movie clip, but we have a couple of pretty important ones here that are very useful, and for animators can be assets that are very useful as well. And the main one is this box here that says filters. So I'm going to bring the properties panel out just to show you a bit clearer what I'm talking about. If I select this movie clip in the filters panel, if I hit this, I get all these options, and I can add a blur to blur my movie clip. I can add a color change to adjust the color, so I might want to change the saturation or the contrast or even the hue to turn it into that sort of reddish color. I can add a bevel to make it sort of pop out a bit. I can add a glow to make it glow. Duh. And so all of a sudden this movie clip is very different to the original graphic, and you can tell how this might be a very useful thing to have. If I'm animating someone who is holding lightning in his hands, I might just animate it in a blank white and then add a blue glow and a blur to it to have this really powerful effect. So you can see how if I hit Control Enter, already I can completely change what the fundamental visual assets of the movie clip are compared to its original state. Now, another thing to keep in mind with the movie clip and the graphic is that if I have a keyframe along the timeline of it and move that keyframe, it won't affect a movie clip where it will affect a graphic. So for example, let's say on frame 30, if I want to tween these two objects up, I can apply the classic tween, and there we go, we have those objects tweened up. If I test it by hitting Control Enter, everything is in sync and it works fine. But if I feel like that motion was a bit too slow and I want it to happen over 10 frames, I can't just select both of these keyframes and pull them back to 10 and then hit Control Enter, because you'll notice something has gone funny. What has happened is that the position that the graphic was in on frame 30 has been dragged to frame 10. So the graphic is going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 30. Do you see what's happened there? It skipped ahead because I pulled frame 30 back, and that's where things can get a little bit sticky. So what I tend to be very conscious of when I'm animating graphic symbols is to really not move the keyframes around, and it can be really tricky to get right sometimes, and it is something that even after 10 years of using Flash, you have to be aware of and be careful of not letting get out of control. Now I'm going to touch on those things in more detail a little bit later with some more interesting visual examples, but I'm now going to have a very quick look at the button. Now, if I double click the button, you can see I've got my own timeline in the sense that I can add layers and do more pictures and stuff, but it looks a little different. And we have these 4 specific frames, one that says up, one that says over, one that says down, and one that says hit. I'm going to explain what these do. Any frames under the word up are what will display when nothing has happened, when the button is in its static, untouched state. If I create a duplicate keyframe on the frame that says over, and change this to that green that we had before, anything under the frame that says over will display when your mouse is detected as being over the area of the button. So if I hit Control Enter and move my mouse over the button, you can see that it's turned that green color. The third frame, the down frame, if I select a duplicate keyframe on that frame, anything displayed on the down frame will show visually when Flash detects that you are clicking on the button. So with this duplicate frame, if I make it a nice red color like this and then hit Control Enter, you can see all three states. So I'm not touching it at the moment. Then if I move my mouse over it, it's green. And if I click, it's red. Now this doesn't have any function at the moment, it's just a button, so it acts like a button and it does that when I click on it. It's a completely separate topic in how to make it a functioning button and do something when you click on it, but the point is, it of those three symbols has that functionality. Then the final frame, hit, is actually something that you don't necessarily need. The hit frame actually controls what we call the hit area of where the button is. So for example, if I have nothing on the hit frame will take as a default everything on the previous frames as the hit area. But let's say if I duplicate this keyframe on the hit area and move it up like this, and then hit Control Enter, you notice if I move my mouse over the symbol, it doesn't do anything. But if I move my mouse over this hit area, there's actually an invisible circle that I'm moving my mouse over there that is making that action happen. So we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in just a moment, but I'm just going to remove the hit frame for now because it actually doesn't serve a purpose for what this is demonstrating. And I'm going to move these symbols up here. And later on, we're going to make a list for all these things, talking about the pros and cons and the specific details as to what their functions are. Now, another thing that you'll notice quite early on when you create symbols is that they show up in something called your library. Now, I have a few folders that I've created in advance here to house some examples that we'll go into in a moment, but when I created the symbols, the button, the graphic, and the movie clip, they show up here as button, graphic, and movie clip, and they have their own little picture. So the button has that little picture, the graphic has that little picture, and the movie clip has that one. Another one of the benefits of creating a symbol is that you can reuse them, and quite simply by clicking and dragging these things, button, graphic, or movie clip, onto the timeline, you can just have the same thing with all the properties that we talked about immediately available. So if I go click and drag these buttons to be everywhere, and then hit Control Enter, all of these are completely individual buttons that have the same action that the original one has that we created. So I'm just going to click and drag these button, graphic, and movie clips into their little folders that I have here, and I'm going to open a couple of other examples. So in my button example, I have my play button. Now I'm going to click and drag this onto the main timeline. This is just an example as to the way I might use this button in context. So if I double click and open this, you can see that quite similarly to our original example, it's just got some different visuals for each of those frames. And if I show it in context, you could see how quite easily, if I put this on a frame of a movie clip or a game or an animation, and it played, I could give that the action and it would quite clearly communicate to the viewer what to do to begin the interaction. And I would add a little bit of code to tell the whole thing to not play until that button was clicked. Now, two final things I want to mention to keep in mind when it comes to buttons is that if you have nothing but text on the hit area of the up, down, and over frames, and then test it, it's a bit finicky. So if your mouse is in the middle bit between letters, it gets a little hard to click. So in that scenario, I would actually add a hit frame and put a box a little bit larger than the size of the text. And that way, it's much easier to select the text area or the play button, as it were. Now I'm going to undo all that just so I can get my lovely visuals back, so that any of you who download the reference files, which are free in the description, you can check that out. But the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to a button is the ability to have what I use as a placeholder. So for example, if I have a movie clip that doesn't have anything visual on the first frame, or something where I want a larger hit area but I don't want it visible in the actual animation, I can quite simply click and drag and create a box and then select it and hit F8, convert it to a button and call it anything like hit area. And I can go inside this and just drag it to the hit box and have nothing on the first few frames. That way, you can see that when I go back to the main timeline, I have this funny looking box, and if I hit Control Enter, nothing visual is there. So the way this is useful is it has something that I can click on, interact with, and go inside that is selectable in the actual animation process, but that has no visual area at all, and that's quite useful at times. So that's the last thing I want to mention with buttons. The next thing we're going to look at in a little bit more detail is the graphic. Now this is the example I have here. This is of Axe from an animation I did called Drow versus Axe, and if I hit enter, you can see him playing out in real time. So if I double click to enter this movie clip, you can actually see that he's got some audio.
By his blade, Axe earns this purchase. By his blade, Axe earns this purchase.
But if I hit Control Enter and play it, there is no audio. So that's another thing that differentiates graphics and movie clips. If I have audio playing through the timeline of a graphic symbol and then play the animation or produce it or publish it, it's got no audio when it plays out in the main timeline. So that's something to keep in mind. Whereas a movie clip that has audio playing through the duration of it will have that playing as people watch it when it's published. Now you'll notice that this is a lot more intricate than the initial circle example that I have set up. It's got a lot of layers and a lot of different graphics, and most of these are graphics. There's something a little different about these that you might notice though once you get your hands into the file, and that is that some of them, for example in the torso, we have different frames, but it's not constantly playing or looping those frames. It's actually stuck on one frame. That's because here on the looping side of the properties panel, it says single frame 1, and that keeps it static on the first frame of all of these frames. But you'll notice when he bends down, it changes, and that's because where it changes, it moves that single frame to number 2. There is an extension to Flash that I use to automate this process and make it simple for animation, where when I select this, you can see there's this panel down here that says keyframe caddy. If I hit load thumbnails, it shows all of the frames inside the clip, and I can quite simply click to create that action of moving the frame number around on the loop static frames panel. So that's something to keep in mind, because it comes in very useful where you can see if I go inside the head movie clip, he's got his own...
By his blade, Axe earns this purchase.
He's got his own facial animation in its own graphic symbol that plays on its own. So if I hide everything except for the mouth and hit load thumbnails, you can see that I've got all these pre-made mouth clips that show, if I double click and enter, that they all just have their own frames for how I animate the mouth. So this enables me to click and alternate the mouth shape based on the predetermined shapes I've animated, and it's just a breeze to animate. So graphic symbols tend to be much more easily manipulated, visually easy to follow as references for animators, and to be able to do things like load the thumbnails and use them in the extension keyframe caddy to do facial animation. It's extremely useful. So graphics tend to be the go-to for most animation. The exception for this rule is if I want to animate something that has some visual effects, if I want to create some filters on it with some blurs or shadows and things like that, I will use a movie clip instead of a graphic symbol. But you can see that quite adequately with nothing but graphics.
By his blade, Axe earns this purchase.
Yes, I get it, Axe, you've earned your purchase by that blade. But you can see that quite adequately with nothing but graphics, I can create a pretty extensively interesting animation. So I'm going to delete that example, and you can check that out in this reference file if you download it. Otherwise, I'm going to open my final example, which is of a movie clip, and it's of this jungle dude. So I'm going to make him a bit bigger just so you can kind of see him in context. But he's an isometric character for a game that I created that was never really turned into a game. Now immediately you can see that it's set up for something that's not a normal animation. If this all played in a row, it would just kind of not make much sense. But I've segmented these frames so that there's this area sectioned off for an idle animation where a coder will tell it to loop this frame section from 1 to 19. And then I've done the same with other various actions. So we have a walk from frame 20 to 44 that will loop if he's walking. Same thing for a run and a use action and a hurt action and a die action. So I've set up this movie clip to have these segments where a coder can tell it to play at certain points based on certain parameters, and this is only doable with a movie clip. It's not doable with a graphic or a button. So movie clips are extremely useful for creating things like games. So in the same way that a coder can tell this movie clip where to start playing in the middle of its animation sets, it can do so in an Inception-like way with movie clips inside movie clips. So for example, if I select his axe, you can see that I have various other little weapons on other frames, but it's stuck on the first frame because I have a section of action script that tells it to stop on that frame. Now I can click and drag that frame to, let's say, frame 4 where there's the dagger, and then if I hit Control Enter to test it, you'll notice that the entire animation set plays through the whole animation set holding the dagger instead of the default, which was the axe. So the coder now has the ability to swap between frames of that movie clip inside that movie clip. So he could, for example, code him to have the hammer when standing idle and use the axe when playing this use clip from frame 60 to 74. And then of course, it being a movie clip, I have the ability to select this and add some filters if I want to. I could blur the whole thing and things like that. So that gives you a little bit more context as to how a movie clip can be used in a game type scenario. And if you want to get your hands dirty and have a bit more of a close look as to how this is set up, make sure to click the link in the description where you can access all of the library assets used in this video tutorial. So the very last thing I'm going to do in this video, and I know it's been a bit more of a boring sort of longer type of video because it's going through some of the more static kind of logistical stuff to do with this, but it's also very important stuff. So especially for the beginners, it's something important to sort of familiarize yourself with. The last thing I'm going to do is create a new layer, and I'm going to call this text in capitals so you know exactly what you're looking at. And I'm just going to create a bit of a list for each of these just to be perfectly clear as to their function. So first off, we have the button. So these are just a few main points that you might want to keep in mind as to the uses of the button symbols. The major benefits is that a button can be coded. So you can code a button to tell the entire clip to do something, to tell the animation to play or to act a certain way. And then of course it has the other little added benefit of being able to be used as a hit area for things like graphics or movie clip symbols where there might not be anything selectable on the first frame, but you don't want anything visible. You just want something to be able to select. Otherwise, something to keep in mind if you're more interested in animation like myself is that there's very little sort of use in an animation. So other than kind of using hit areas or a play button, there's not much you're going to be using buttons for. And then finally, it's got a different timeline. It's not got its own kind of expansive timeline, so it's got a limited use in that sense. Now we get to movie clips, and there are a few more pros with this and a few more cons. Movie clips loop for as long as they are visible. So forever where they are present on the main timeline, they will naturally always loop. And as you could tell from the very beginning of this tutorial, there was one frame, but it still looped over the 50 frames that we gave it. They can be coded and dynamic. Therefore, they are useful in things like animating video game characters when you're making web games or apps. You can apply filters and effects, so blurs, glows, bevels, all that fun stuff. And the audio will be rendered. So if you have an animation playing where you have audio through the timeline of the movie clip and then you produce the final animation and then convert it to a video, the audio will be heard and convertible and all that stuff if it's in a movie clip. Now the cons are most obviously that it doesn't play in the main timeline and therefore it's difficult for extensive animation because there's no visual reference. So if you animate a character walking on a walk cycle in movie clip and moving from point A to point B, if you're using a movie clip, you never know the position of their legs and arms after a certain duration, and you don't actually know how to carry on the animation from there if it moves into another clip or anything like that. Now finally we get to the graphic type symbol. These have great frame control, meaning that through apps like Keyframe Caddy, which is an extension here that I have on the right, or just simply through using the looping function here on the left and selecting frames, you are actually able to control and stop at certain points of the animation. The next point is that they are a great visual reference. So if you're animating someone's facial animation and that is a graphic, you can see exactly at what point in their clip it's playing, and then you can animate that in its own clip to kind of move the head around as it's talking. So it's a really great thing to have that constant visual reference. So these two things of course make it ideal for character animation, where you constantly need to see what has been done and how it's syncing with audio and things like that. But then of course a couple of the cons are that the audio cannot be heard if there is audio in the graphic symbol. So I tend to work on graphic symbols and then have audio playing on the main timeline. And then of course that you can bugger up your graphic symbols pretty easily. So if you create a keyframe in a playing graphic symbol on the main timeline and move that, it actually moves the entire animation segment across, and it won't play in the sync that you've set it up in its original form. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen, that is our video tutorial for today. It's a bit of a vanilla one, but it's also an extremely important one. So I hope I've helped some of you with your understanding of these things. Thank you for joining me, and if you want to check out the references, make sure to click in the description or check out the tutorial archive to get all the references for every tutorial I've ever done. Thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen, and until next time, I'll see you later. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel to see new content every week. Check out more of my stuff by clicking the annotations over there. You can get the reference files for this tutorial by clicking the link in the description, and if you want the reference files for all the tutorials I've ever made, check out the tutorial archive. If you're looking for a great place to collaborate, explore, or share your own content, head over to newgrounds.com. That's it for now, and until next time, see you later.